The house on Hollow Lane stood like a monument carved out of silence, its stone walls carrying the weight of centuries, its windows never fully opened, its gardens trimmed too perfectly, as if human hands worked to erase every sign of natural disorder. The villagers called it graceful, admired its symmetry, whispered about its stillness, but none could say they had ever heard laughter spill from its halls or the cry of a child echo across its grounds. To outsiders, the Ridley family appeared the model of restraint, a lineage of piety and charitable duty, forever offering coins to the poor and prayers at the parish altar. But beneath that polished surface there was something off, something that clung to the estate like a shadow at noon. The Ridleys were never seen arguing, never heard raising their voices, never caught in the common stumblings of ordinary people. To live without noise, without flaw, was not a gift, it was a warning. Thomas Ridley was regarded as a man of medicine, his hands precise, his knowledge of ailments impressive, and his reputation spotless. He treated the sick with calm eyes, never charging the desperate, never faltering in his composure. Margaret Ridley was known for her devotion, a woman always seen clutching prayer beads, guiding village children in hymns, her soft voice carrying comfort. Together they walked like figures sculpted for display, admired but never touched. Their children, though, were different. Pale, thin, rarely glimpsed outside the carriage or behind the curtains, they seemed to drift through life as quiet as the house itself. Some villagers swore there were more children than the family ever admitted to, faces seen at high windows and then never seen again. Yet no one dared to press. To question the Ridleys was to question charity itself. And who would accuse the pious of darkness when their hands so often gave bread to the hungry? Still, the estate carried a kind of pressure, an unnatural hush that fell when one drew near its gates. Dogs refused to linger at its hedges, children ran when their games led them too close, and travelers often spoke of a stillness that suffocated the lane at dusk, as if the air itself recoiled from the house. Servants who worked inside often lasted only months, speaking of strict rules, doors locked at nightfall, shutters barred even in summer, and an insistence that no sound louder than a whisper passed through the halls. A single slammed door was met with dismissal. A cough during prayers earned a warning glance from Margaret that chilled the blood. The Ridleys called it discipline, a life ordered by silence and reverence. But to those who left it was something darker, a doctrine that erased human noise as though it were sin. Whispers grew over time, passed from hearth to hearth. They said the Ridleys kept a separate wing in the house sealed off, its windows bricked, its doors bolted. Smoke was sometimes seen rising from a narrow chimney at odd hours, thin and black, curling upward in defiance of the clear sky. The story spread that the family burned more than wood there, though none could prove it. And yet when livestock went missing, when paupers who had knocked at the Ridley gate vanished without trace, the gossip tightened. Some claimed to hear faint cries beneath the earth near the garden walls like voices smothered by stone. Others insisted it was only wind, only the trick of night. But the fear remained. For every act of kindness shown in daylight, there seemed to be a shadow stretching longer behind it. The Ridleys' reputation kept suspicion at bay, yet those who truly watched knew something inside that house thrived on secrecy. They had built a life where silence was worshipped, where stillness was demanded, where innocence was their mask. The estate on Hollow Lane was not admired because it was calm. It was feared because it was too calm, too perfect, too controlled. And the villagers who spoke of its strange quiet learned to do so only in whispers, as though the house itself might be listening. What the world did not yet see was that silence was not the absence of life within the Ridley home. It was the very foundation of a hidden order, a system of control older than the family's own name. The quiet house on Hollow Lane did not simply guard its secrets, it thrived on them, keeping its horrors wrapped so tightly in respectability that no one dared peel away the layers. What seemed like a model estate was already something else entirely, an altar where silence itself had become the first sacrifice. And in the years to come, that silence would burn louder than any scream. Thomas Ridley carried himself as the kind of man who seemed to exist above suspicion. His every gesture measured, his words chosen with a surgeon's care. He was respected not only because he healed wounds and treated sickness, but because he gave the impression of certainty in a world filled with doubt. Villagers trusted his steady hand, yet they rarely saw warmth in his gaze. To them, his calmness was proof of knowledge, but behind that composure lay a mind that observed people less as souls and more as specimens, living bodies to be studied, their weaknesses catalogued, their limits tested. What he presented as mercy was in truth a quiet rehearsal for control. He offered cures to the ill, but he remembered which herbs brought relief and which slowed the heartbeat. He tested balances and dosages, keeping private records of how much pain a body could endure before the skin turned pale, before breathing grew shallow. His journals were filled not with prayers for the sick, but with notes of method, as if every human he touched was a trial in a private experiment. Margaret Ridley played a different role, though no less calculated. She walked among the women of the parish with eyes lowered and words dipped in kindness, teaching patience and sacrifice as if she were born to guide. She organized hymns, distributed bread, and visited the poor, always with an air of gentle resignation. But her piety was not the tender faith it appeared to be. To her, devotion was not love, it was submission. She whispered that silence in suffering brought one closer to God, that obedience was more sacred than joy, and that children must be shaped not by comfort, but by fire. The village women admired her self-control, envied her discipline, and welcomed her guidance in raising their own. Yet none knew that the same discipline governed her children not as a virtue, but as a cage. Margaret did not seek holiness in prayer. She sought to erase the will of others until their silence proved her power complete. The Ridley children bore the weight of their parents' performance most of all. Frail, pale, their limbs thin as reeds, they were rarely seen outdoors. When they did appear, they stood in rigid lines, their hands folded, their eyes avoiding contact. Villagers remarked that the children never played, never laughed, never called to one another. Some claimed their voices were soft to the point of vanishing, as if even speaking had been trained out of them. Others swore they caught sight of bruises on wrists or faint scars along their hairlines, but those stories died as quickly as they rose. It was easier to believe the children were simply delicate, that their constitution was poor, than to imagine what truth might lie behind the locked shutters of Hollow Lane. Silence became their inheritance, passed down like a family heirloom, so natural that their absence from life itself felt ordinary. Inside the house, the children's lives followed rules that the outside world would not have dared to imagine. Doors were locked not only to protect them from wandering, but to contain them, to ensure their movements were never uncontrolled. Curtains were drawn at all times, not for privacy, but to starve them of sunlight, to weaken their bodies until even the smallest breath outside seemed overwhelming. Meals were portioned with deliberate cruelty, enough to sustain life, but never enough to satisfy. The hunger hollowed them, the weakness kept them pliant, and the fear of punishment sealed their lips. The Ridleys called it discipline, but in truth it was a slow erasure of personhood, a calculated reduction of the human form into something Thomas could examine and Margaret could mold. The villagers saw none of this. They saw a physician who healed their wounds, a woman who prayed with them, and children too fragile for the roughness of ordinary life. They saw a house where curtains hung heavy and doors were locked, but they excused it as the habits of a family too careful, too protective. The truth was far worse. The Ridleys had perfected the art of wearing masks, presenting the face of charity while practicing the craft of domination behind closed doors. Their kindness was their shield, their silence their weapon, and their children the canvas on which they wrote their doctrine. And though the world around them admired their composure, what grew inside that house was not holiness, but something that belonged more to ritual than to faith, more to cruelty than to care. The family of masks had begun to show the world their innocence, while hiding behind it a darkness methodical enough to last for generations. At the farthest edge of the Ridley estate, past the gardens where roses bloomed too richly to be natural, stood a small wing that few servants dared approach. Its windows were narrow, its stone blackened, its chimney exhaling thin trails of smoke that never seemed to rest, even in summer when fires in other homes lay cold. The Ridleys explained it away with ease, telling curious eyes that it was a chamber for disposing of sick livestock or spoiled provisions, a necessary place where ash consumed what could not be kept. And the villagers accepted the excuse, for who wished to believe otherwise when the family's reputation gleamed so clean? Yet whispers lingered, born from servants who carried water to its doors and came back pale, their voices lowered when they spoke of what they saw. The chamber was never quiet. Even in the stillness of night, a faint hum seemed to rise from its walls as if the air itself recoiled from the heat within. Servants described the way their skin prickled when they entered, how the smoke clung to their clothes longer than ordinary fire, carrying with it a stench that could not be mistaken for wood or animal flesh. Some claimed the air carried a sweetness that turned the stomach, something human in its weight. They spoke of shadows that did not match their movement, flickering strangely against the stone, as though the fire inside did not burn like any other flame. The Ridleys forbade questions, and those who pressed too hard were dismissed without pay, their silence purchased by the threat of ruin. What no one beyond the family truly saw was the purpose of the chamber. For Thomas Ridley, it was a laboratory disguised as a furnace. He treated it not as a place of waste, but as an altar of method. Within its walls, he tested the limits of the body against heat, not through crude flame, but through precise exposure, measuring how long skin could withstand warmth before blistering, how lungs collapsed when air grew too thin, how bones fractured when dried too quickly in fire. The chamber was his scripture, the ash his record. Margaret, too, found meaning in its use. For her, the act of burning was not disposal but purification. She whispered that fire erased sin, that only through ash could the soul ascend clean. Each handful of soot gathered from the chamber was, in her eyes, a relic, stored in jars and hidden away in cupboards where servants would never think to look. Children were brought there under pretense of discipline. They were told the chamber would cleanse them, that its heat would draw out disobedience. At first they were forced to kneel near the iron walls, the glow painting their faces red, the silence demanded of them while their skin baked under the heat. If they screamed, the punishment grew harsher. Their small bodies were taught to tremble in silence, to endure as the fire gnawed at them without flame touching their flesh. Those who fainted were dragged out, their weakness recorded, their bodies marked with burns that healed into scars no one outside the house would ever see. And when one child finally broke, unable to remain quiet, the chamber revealed its true design. Smoke rose not from livestock, but from innocence itself, consumed until nothing remained but powder that drifted like dust in the cracks of the stone. The servants never knew what they cleaned, only that they swept ash into buckets and dumped it into the soil behind the house where roses grew unnaturally tall. They did not ask why the ash was sometimes pale, almost white, or why the chamber never emptied despite so much burning. They told themselves it was livestock, that the Ridleys were protecting them from disease, but their eyes betrayed them when they glanced at one another, knowing but not daring to speak. Fear of the Ridleys, fear of their quiet authority bound their tongues. The chamber of ash was more than a hidden furnace. It was the family's heartbeat, their private place where silence and fire worked hand in hand. To the Ridleys, it was proof that life could be reduced, measured, broken, and remade into something obedient. To the outside world, it was only smoke in the air explained away with ease. But to those who drew near, it became a mark of dread, the kind of place where the soul itself seemed to recoil. And though the estate still carried the mask of charity and devotion, the truth had begun to bleed through the walls, drifting upward in thin black streams that no sky could cleanse. The chamber was always burning, and the world did not yet know what it was consuming. The Ridley family did not invent their cruelty, they inherited it. Long before the house on Hollow Lane, their name was etched into the margins of forgotten manuscripts, their history whispered in monasteries and scattered among the possessions of exiled midwives and wandering alchemists. Servants who stumbled across locked chests in the attic found books whose bindings crumbled at a touch, their pages filled with diagrams of infants wrapped not in swaddling cloth but in bands of iron, mouths covered in stitched veils, eyes pressed shut with weighted stones. These were not instructions for healing or protection, but rituals that aimed to strip sound from the living, shaping children into silent vessels, before their first words could take form. To the Ridleys, silence was not a virtue, it was an inheritance, a tradition rooted in the belief that obedience must begin not in thought, but in the body itself. Thomas Ridley, trained in medicine, read these texts with the devotion of a scholar, but he did not dismiss them as superstition. He saw in them a language of control, a method older than science, yet in line with his own need to measure the boundaries of human endurance. He told himself he was continuing a family practice of knowledge, not cruelty, though every page he turned bled with torment disguised as doctrine. Margaret, too, found purpose in the journals. Where her husband sought method, she sought meaning. The midwives who wrote centuries before her claimed that pain purified, that a child who was broken early would never resist authority. To Margaret, this was sacred law. She believed her family had been chosen to carry it forward, that the silenced children were sacrifices offered not to gods or demons, but to the higher order of discipline. The journals spoke of rituals passed from generation to generation. One described the binding of breath, where newborns were wrapped in damp cloth to the edge of suffocation, teaching them from their first gasp that silence was survival. Another detailed the weight of obedience, where infants were placed beneath carved stones said to press their spirit flat, their limbs trembling until they no longer dared to move. A third was called the fire of devotion, a practice in which children were set near glowing coals in darkness, taught to stare at the light without crying. These rituals, preserved in fading ink and brittle paper, became the backbone of the Ridley doctrine. They did not see them as cruelty, but as proof that their lineage had always understood a secret others feared to name. That silence could be forced into the bones, woven into flesh until it became nature itself. The servants who glimpsed these texts never spoke openly. A stable boy once found a page pinned to the wall of the chamber, its ink smeared by heat, its sketch showing a child bound to a wooden frame. He told another boy, and together they swore they would never mention it again, for both believed the family would bury them alive if they knew. Yet the knowledge spread in whispers, reaching even the village priest, who dismissed it as rumor. No one wished to confront the idea that the respected physician and his saintly wife were simply enacting rituals handed down through centuries of blood. Inside the Ridley home, these practices were not performed with frenzy but with calm precision. Thomas measured pulses while Margaret whispered prayers, both believing they were upholding tradition. The children endured not only their parents' cruelty but the weight of ancestors who demanded it from beyond the grave. Every scar, every burn, every bruise became a testament to a history that insisted silence was the highest inheritance. What began as alchemy and superstition had been reborn in the Ridleys as method, disguised behind locked doors and drawn curtains. The inheritance of pain was not carried in objects alone. It lived in the very way the family breathed, in the way their footsteps fell soft, in the way their voices rarely rose above whispers. Their lineage had woven cruelty so tightly into daily life that it no longer felt like choice. To the Ridleys it was destiny, and though the village believed they were merely a family of discipline and charity, what truly passed from one Ridley to the next was a doctrine that demanded children be silenced before they ever knew how to speak. The journals remained hidden, their pages brittle, but their influence burned as fiercely as the chamber's fires. The Ridleys had inherited more than land and wealth. They had inherited a creed that promised power through silence, and they would pass it on no matter how much suffering it required. The birth of the first Ridley child should have been an occasion of joy, but within the walls of Hollow Lane it was nothing more than the beginning of a ritual. The infant entered the world weak and trembling, his cries muffled almost as soon as they left his lips. Thomas Ridley received him not with the tenderness of a father, but with the detachment of a physician, studying the weight, the breath, the pulse, and committing each detail to memory. Margaret pressed no lullaby to the child's ears, nor did she allow the warmth of her arms to linger. Instead, she whispered prayers of silence, words that promised salvation through stillness, and she ordered that the newborn be carried not to a cradle but to a small locked room set aside long before his arrival. This chamber was prepared as carefully as any altar, its walls thick with stone, its shutters fastened, its floor bare except for a single iron brazier that filled the air with an orange glow. It was here that the Ridleys began their first experiment, not to nurture life, but to strip it of sound, to bend it into obedience before the child even knew the world. The baby's days passed in cycles of deprivation, each carefully measured by Thomas with the calm precision of one who believed himself a keeper of hidden law. Sounds were withdrawn until the child knew only the hum of fire, the low creak of the brazier's iron, and the steady drip of water from a copper pipe. Nurses were forbidden to speak, their mouths covered with cloth when they entered, their eyes lowered as they laid the infant back down. If the child cried, his mouth was muffled with cloth soaked in bitter tinctures, teaching him that noise brought only pain. Margaret oversaw these moments with a devotion that bordered on worship, her hands folded in prayer as if she were guiding the soul of the child into purity. To her, silence was not cruelty but a gift, a path to holiness. To Thomas it was dada, each muffled cry a measure of progress toward the perfect subject. The room itself became an instrument. Light was controlled to the smallest degree. Days were spent in near darkness where the child learned to move without sight, to reach out and find only cold stone. Nights were interrupted by sudden bursts of firelight, the brazier flaring with sulfur that seared the infant's eyes and forced him into submission. Heat and cold alternated at the Ridley's command, conditioning the small body to endure extremes without protest. When the baby reached for comfort, there was none. When he cried for touch, silence answered. When he struggled, his body was swaddled tight and pressed against stone until exhaustion overtook him. Each act was carried out not in anger, but in calm ritual, as though the Ridleys were conducting a service in which suffering itself was the hymn. As months passed, the child's cries grew weaker, his movements less certain. His tiny chest rose and fell as though weighed down by unseen hands, his eyes drifting with confusion, his mouth often closed as if he had already learned that to speak was dangerous. To the Ridleys, this was triumph. Thomas noted with satisfaction how long the child could endure without sound. Margaret praised the stillness as evidence that obedience had taken root. They convinced themselves that what they had created was not merely a child, but a vessel, an empty shell to be filled with their doctrine. In their minds, the silence of the firstborn was proof that pain could shape life before memory could resist. But the silence came at a cost. The infant's body weakened, his frame too fragile, his breath too shallow. Servants whispered that he would not live long, but Margaret silenced them with scripture and Thomas with threats. They insisted survival was irrelevant. What mattered was the method the practice perfected. The first child became not a son but a subject, his suffering the foundation upon which all future rituals would be built. He had been born into a family of masks, and from his first breath he was denied the right to be human. The locked room where he lay was more than a nursery. It was a place where innocence was dismantled, where firelight and silence replaced cradle songs, and where the Ridleys convinced themselves that cruelty was devotion. The child survived, though diminished, his life stretched out in unnatural quiet, his will extinguished before it could form. And as the smoke from the chamber of ash drifted faintly through the estate, the family prepared for what would come next, already planning how each new child would be refined with greater precision, greater silence, greater pain. The firstborn had become the Ridleys' proof that life could be broken before it ever began to speak. The fire ritual began as nothing more than a test, but within the Ridley house it became law. The chamber where smoke never ceased was not enough for Thomas and Margaret. They wanted fire itself to become a language, a teacher that carved its lessons into flesh. For them, heat was not simply punishment, but purification. They believed that silence could only take root if fear was married to flame, if the body remembered in its very skin that disobedience would be answered with burning. So they created a ritual in which their children were led, one by one, into a narrow stone room lit by nothing but a brazier glowing with embers. No flame licked the air, only heat that suffocated without touch. The children were placed on their knees, their small faces turned toward the orange light, and ordered to remain still and silent while the air grew heavy around them. At first, the ritual seemed almost harmless. The brazier burned low, its glow soft, its warmth bearable. The children were told to stay quiet, to breathe in rhythm, to prove their devotion through stillness. But as time passed, Thomas stoked the embers until the air itself burned, the walls sweating with heat, their skin prickling, their lips drying. The children began to tremble, their hands twitching, their eyes watering. It was then that the true lesson began. Margaret, standing close, whispered prayers of purification, telling them that pain was a test of their souls. If one whimpered, the sound was met with sharp glares. If one shifted or raised a hand to shield their face, Thomas took note in his ledger, writing down the exact moment when weakness revealed itself. But if one cried out, if the silence was broken, the ritual shifted into cruelty beyond imagining. The punishment for breaking silence was escalation. Thomas drew iron rods from the brazier, not yet flaming but hot enough to sear. He held them near the child's skin, letting the heat hover like a ghost of fire, burning without touch. The child's breath grew frantic, their body twisting away, though no contact had yet been made. Margaret would call for prayer, demanding stillness, praising the ones who did not flinch as chosen, condemning the ones who wept as failures. And if a scream escaped, the rod touched flesh, pressing just enough to blister but not enough to kill. It was measured, calculated, applied in places where the scar would hide beneath clothing. Each cry was smothered with cloth, and each wound was recorded in Thomas's notes, proof of progress in their grotesque study. The ritual grew darker with time. The brazier was not always filled with simple coal. Sometimes Thomas burned mixtures of herbs and oils, substances that released smoke designed to choke the lungs, leaving the children gasping for air. Other times, Margaret scattered powders that sparked violently, sending bursts of light across the walls, terrifying the children into greater submission. Always the demand was the same: endure in silence, survive without sound, prove your devotion through stillness, or be marked as unworthy. The children learned quickly that their only hope of avoiding scars was to vanish into quiet, to bite down on their tongues, to train their bodies not to cry even when pain tore through them. But the ritual did more than harm their flesh. It reshaped their minds. Children who once whimpered at the smallest cut grew blank, their faces pale masks of obedience. They no longer reached for comfort, no longer cried when hurt, no longer spoke unless spoken to. The fire had taught them that noise was death, that sound would summon pain. Their silence was no longer simple obedience. It was survival. And this was exactly what Thomas and Margaret desired. They convinced themselves that the fire had worked, that they had burned sin out of their offspring, that what emerged from the ritual was not broken but purified. The servants, forced to clean the chamber afterward, found scraps of skin stuck to the floor, cloths soaked in blood hidden in corners, the stench of char lingering long after the embers died. They whispered of the fire ritual but never spoke aloud, for to accuse the Ridleys was to invite ruin. They told themselves it was discipline, harsh but necessary, though in their hearts they knew it was worse. The Ridleys had found a way to use fire not only as punishment but as a tool of control, reducing their children into silent effigies of obedience. The house on Hollow Lane had always been quiet, but now the silence was different. It was not stillness born of peace, but silence beaten and burned into flesh, silence forged in heat, silence that no child dared break again. And as smoke rose thinly from the chimney once more, the ritual ended for that day, only to begin again with the next. The Ridleys had made fire into their gospel, silence into their scripture, and suffering into their inheritance. What began as controlled burns of discipline was quickly becoming something deeper, something ritualistic, something that blurred the line between devotion and cruelty until there was no line at all. The table stood in the center of a locked chamber carved from oak so heavy it seemed rooted to the earth itself. To the servants it was only a piece of furniture, polished to a dark shine. But to Thomas and Margaret Ridley it was far more. They called it the Table of Stillness, a name spoken with the same gravity others gave to altars. Its surface was scarred with marks not of knives or feasts, but of tools designed to restrain, its edges fitted with wooden frames that could fold and lock around a body like the jaws of a trap. It was not built to serve meals or to host prayer. It was built to strip a child of motion, to turn flesh into stone, to teach the lesson that resistance was useless. The ritual began in silence. A child was led into the chamber, stripped of voice and choice, and laid flat upon the table. The frames were lowered, pressing against arms and legs until they could no longer twitch. The chest was pinned beneath curved wood that rose and fell with every shallow breath, reminding the child that even the act of breathing could be controlled. No ropes were used, no chains clanked against the walls. The Ridleys preferred wood, for it seemed almost innocent, almost natural, as if the tree itself bore witness to the suffering it now enforced. Once secured, the child was left there, eyes open, body stiff, unable to move for hours that stretched into days. Thomas approached these sessions with the curiosity of a scholar. He kept careful notes, observing how long before the body began to tremble, how long before muscles twitched and joints stiffened, how long before exhaustion set in and the will collapsed into numb surrender. He wrote of the skin breaking into sores against the oak, of nails digging into palms until blood seeped, of eyes that refused to close even as sleep clawed at them, because the frames would not allow the head to turn or rest. Margaret, by contrast, oversaw the suffering as a sacred act. She whispered that stillness was a prayer, that silence while bound was proof of purity. If the child moaned, she pressed cloth into their mouth. If the child wept, she dabbed the tears with her rosary beads, claiming each drop as an offering. The cruelty of the table was not in the pain of wounds, but in the slow erosion of self. The children did not leave with broken bones, but with broken memory. Hours stretched into days until they forgot the sensation of standing, of walking freely, of choosing to lift a hand. Their minds collapsed inward, lost in the endless present of stillness. They began to associate motion with danger, silence with survival, immobility with safety. When they were finally released, their legs buckled, their hands shook, and their voices came out hoarse, if they dared to speak at all. Some did not cry when lifted from the table, for the instinct to resist had been drained from them entirely. The servants who cleaned the chamber afterward spoke of the stench of sweat, of cloth stained dark from drool and tears, of the faint scratches carved into the wood where fingernails had clawed in desperation. Yet the table was polished again, restored to its dark shine, ready for the next child. The Ridleys justified it as correction, as discipline. But in truth it was ritualized torment, a practice passed down like scripture. To them the table was not cruelty, it was refinement, a way to transform their children into obedient vessels by forcing them to live through the slow death of resistance. The table of stillness became the heart of their doctrine. Fire had taught the children fear, but the table taught them surrender. It showed them that not even their own bodies belonged to them, that every motion could be stolen, every choice taken, every moment reduced to waiting under the weight of oak. By the time the sessions ended, the children no longer needed chains. They had learned the deeper lesson. To resist was useless, to move was dangerous, to speak was forbidden. The table had done what words and threats could not. It had erased the memory of freedom itself, leaving only silence and obedience carved into their minds like scars on wood. And so the table remained silent and patient, waiting for the next body, the next breath to be pinned beneath its weight. It stood as proof that in the Ridley house, even furniture could be turned into an instrument of doctrine, an altar of control, a stage where innocence was dismantled piece by piece. The children learned that silence was not simply demanded. It was built into their bones, carved into their skin until they no longer knew what it was to resist. The house grew quieter with each ritual, not because peace reigned, but because stillness had become the only way to survive. Margaret Ridley believed silence could not only be taught through fire and stillness, but sealed into the body itself. For her, the mouth was the enemy, the vessel of sound, the betrayer of devotion. She devised a ritual that would turn even the act of crying into a curse, something so dangerous that children would learn to fear their own voices. It began with glass, molten, glowing, drawn from the furnace in trembling sheets. She would have Thomas cool it slowly, shaping thin, fragile pieces into curved forms that matched the size of a child's mouth. They were delicate, almost beautiful, their surfaces shimmering faintly as if they held light within. But beauty here was only the mask of cruelty. For once cooled, each piece became a restraint, a prison for the mouth. Fitted not with rope or straps, but by its very fragility. Margaret called them mouth guards of purity, The servants whispered another name, the glass mouth. The ritual was performed in secret, deep in the wing where no outsider could wander. The children were lined against the wall, their eyes wide, their bodies trembling, forced to watch as the molten glass was cooled and molded into place. When one mask hardened, Margaret pressed it against a child's lips, fastening it with cloth ties that looped around the head. The glass sat so lightly it seemed harmless, but its danger lay in its brittleness. The child was told to remain silent, to endure, for if they spoke or cried out, the fragile shell would crack and cut deep into the flesh beneath. The rules were clear. Silence meant survival. Sound meant scars. It was a lesson carved not into memory but into skin. At first the children struggled, their small breaths fogging the surface. Their lips twitched, their throats quivered, but they dared not let the air rise into sound. When fear overcame one, when a muffled sob escaped, the mask fractured with a sharp snap, and shards of glass bit into tender flesh. Blood followed, and with it screams that only deepened the punishment. Thomas recorded the reactions carefully, noting how much pressure was needed before the mask split, how deep the shards cut, how long it took for the wounds to scar. Margaret, unmoved by the cries, saw the scars as holy brands, proof of failure, proof that silence had not yet been learned. Those who bled carried their shame across their faces forever, marked as examples for the others. The ritual was repeated until terror itself took root. Soon the children no longer dared to breathe too loudly. They sat rigid, their mouths hidden beneath glass, their eyes staring at the floor, their bodies frozen in dread of the slightest sound. Even when the masks were removed, the fear lingered. Their voices grew faint, their words reduced to whispers, as if their throats themselves remembered the bite of glass. Silence no longer came from obedience alone. It came from trauma carved into the lips and cheeks of those who had failed. Margaret had succeeded in her cruel design. She had turned the children's own bodies against them, teaching them that even a single cry could draw blood. The servants who glimpsed the aftermath were horrified. They found fragments of glass scattered across the floor, cloth stained with blood hidden in the corners, children with lips swollen and scarred. Yet no one dared speak. To accuse Margaret was to accuse piety itself, for she cloaked her cruelty in scripture and charity. She claimed the ritual was a cleansing, a way to silence sin at its source, and she convinced herself that she was saving the children from themselves. To her, the glass mouth was not torture but sacrament, proof that silence could be sealed upon a soul forever. The estate grew quieter still after the ritual began. The halls no longer echoed with the faintest whimper or sigh. Even in the dead of night, the house lay still, its silence so complete it seemed unnatural, as if life itself had been pressed beneath glass. The children moved like ghosts, their mouths scarred, their voices broken, their fear eternal. And in the Ridley home, this silence was celebrated as victory. The glass mouths had done their work, and the family now believed they had perfected the art of obedience. But beneath that calm surface, the scars told another truth. Silence had not been freely given. It had been cut into flesh, bought with blood and enforced with pain that could never be forgotten. The Ridleys had turned innocence into ritual, devotion into disfigurement, and silence into the only language left to those who survived. Samuel Ridley was the third-born son, a boy whose silence had been perfected through years of ritual. He was pale, thin, and almost spectral, his eyes carrying the emptiness of one who had learned never to speak, never to resist. Neighbors rarely saw him, and when they did, it was always from a distance, his small figure behind a shutter, his outline in the carriage window, his face pressed against glass with no expression at all. To the villagers, his absence was nothing unusual. The Ridley children were all frail, and when Samuel disappeared entirely, the whispers turned quickly to sickness. They said he must have been too weak to survive, taken by a fever. His body buried quietly in the family plot. Yet no grave was marked, no service was held, and the earth in the cemetery remained untouched. What the world did not know was that Samuel had not been lost to illness. He had been chosen. Inside the Ridley home, Samuel's disappearance followed weeks of preparation. Thomas and Margaret had grown increasingly convinced that silence alone was not enough, that true devotion required sacrifice. Margaret whispered that their ancestors had spoken of fire not only as purification but as offering, that ash itself could become holy when given with intent. Thomas, with his physician's cold logic, agreed that one child could serve as proof, a living body transformed into a doctrine written in smoke. Samuel had been marked for this purpose not because he was weak, but because he was silent to the point of vanishing, the perfect vessel for their belief. His lack of resistance made him, in their minds, pure enough to burn. On the night chosen, Samuel was taken into the chamber of ash. The brazier glowed, its heat suffocating the room, and the boy was laid on a wooden stretcher prepared long before his birth. Margaret prayed over him, her hands moving as though she were blessing a saint, whispering that his silence would carry him upward, that his suffering would make the family's devotion complete. Thomas recorded every moment, his quill scratching notes as the fire rose higher. The boy did not cry. He did not fight. He lay still, his lips closed, his body thin enough that the flames devoured him quickly. The smell drifted through the estate, acrid and unmistakable, but the Ridleys called it holy smoke. To them, Samuel's body was not destroyed. It was given, transformed into ash that would nourish their creed. When dawn came, the chimney carried thin black trails that villagers noticed but did not question. They saw the shutters drawn tighter, the Ridleys walking the grounds with calm faces, and they assumed grief had closed them in. The truth lay in the small urn Margaret carried into the locked wing. Inside it was not livestock ash nor burned wood, but the remains of her son. She placed it on the altar-like shelf beside jars of soot gathered from earlier punishments, declaring it a relic. For Thomas, the ritual was a success. He had proven that silence could endure even in death, that Samuel's voice had never once broken, even as flames consumed him. The servants who worked in the house suspected otherwise. They smelled the stench that lingered heavier than animal burning, and they noticed Samuel's absence without a word. They whispered among themselves that no grave had been dug, that no coffin had left the grounds, and they wondered if the family had finally crossed a line even darker than before. But fear held their tongues. To accuse the Ridleys would be to invite ruin, and so the whispers remained behind closed doors. Samuel's disappearance was explained away as disease, but his fate marked a turning point. The Ridleys had crossed from ritualized discipline into ritualized offering. The chamber of ash was no longer only a place of punishment. It had become an altar, a furnace where innocence itself could be transformed into devotion. The house grew heavier after that night, its silence more suffocating, as though the walls remembered the burning and carried the echo of Samuel's vanishing. The neighbors moved on, convinced a child had simply died. But within the estate, the truth was held as sacred. Samuel had not been lost. He had been given, sacrificed in fire to prove that silence could outlast even death. And in that belief, the Ridleys found justification for everything still to come. Behind the Ridley estate stretched a garden that seemed untouched by season or storm. Its roses bloomed thick and crimson even in months when other flowers wilted, their petals lush, their stems thorned and strong. Visitors praised its beauty, calling it the pride of Hollow Lane, a wonder of careful tending. Yet no one outside the family knew the true nourishment that fed those roots. For beneath the soil lay more than compost. The ash from the chamber, gathered carefully after each ritual, was buried in measured rows, poured directly into the earth where roses had been planted like markers. Each flower was not a decoration but a headstone, each bloom rising from what once had been a child reduced to dust. The garden was not a sanctuary, it was a graveyard disguised as beauty. Margaret Ridley tended the roses with devotion, her hands gentle as she pressed the soil, her prayers whispered as though each petal carried a soul. To her, the garden was living proof that sacrifice bore fruit, that silence in suffering transformed into eternal bloom. She called the roses angelic, insisting they were watered by purity itself. Thomas, by contrast, saw the garden as evidence of method, noting in his ledger how each row flourished with stronger color after each burial, how the soil seemed richer, how the flowers bloomed longer. For him, it was confirmation that their rituals left not only scars but legacy, a cycle of silence that would never end. The villagers admired from afar, never asking how such beauty endured. They praised the Ridleys for their skill, accepting cut flowers for weddings, funerals, and festivals, never realizing the horror they carried in their hands. They inhaled the sweet fragrance without knowing it masked the stench of burned innocence. They smiled at Margaret's gift of roses, never seeing the silent devotion buried beneath. And so the garden thrived, row upon row of blossoms fed by ash, each one a testament to the doctrine of silence, each one a reminder that behind the estate's calm exterior lay a truth so grotesque that no one dared to imagine it. The garden became both mask and monument, admired in daylight but soaked in the horror of what it concealed, growing more radiant with every child it consumed. When word of the Ridley estate's unbroken silence reached the diocese, suspicion finally stirred. Rumors of smoke, of shuttered rooms, of children who appeared and then vanished, reached ears too high to be ignored. And so the church sent an inquisitor, a man trained to sniff out heresy. His arrival cloaked in authority and scripture. He came with the expectation of uncovering sin, carrying with him a stern gaze and questions sharp enough to pierce ordinary deceit. Yet even he was not prepared for the stage the Ridleys had prepared. The estate greeted him with charity. Servants lined the halls with baskets of bread for the poor. Hymns were sung softly from a chamber filled with children borrowed from neighboring families. And Margaret walked at his side like a saint, her hands folded, her eyes lowered, her voice trembling with humility. Thomas led him through corridors that smelled of lavender and smoke from the kitchens, not the furnace. And every locked door had been carefully concealed by false walls or hidden passages that guided him away from the wing where silence was enforced. What he saw was order, discipline, and piety. Not the chamber of ash, not the table of stillness, not the glass mouths waiting in the dark. The inquisitor asked why the halls were so quiet, why no laughter echoed, why the children he saw did not speak. Margaret explained that silence was their form of prayer, that the house had been dedicated to reflection and reverence. The words soothed him. In his world, silence was sacred, proof of obedience, a sign of holiness. He mistook trauma for devotion, scars for discipline, terror for faith. And as he left, he praised the Ridleys for their example, writing that the house on Hollow Lane was a place of purity, a model for all Christian families to follow. When the gates closed behind him, the silence returned heavier than before. The children were led back into their hidden chambers, the masks of charity discarded, the rituals prepared once more. The inquisitor had seen only what he was meant to see, and his blessing gave the Ridleys freedom to continue. The estate's silence had fooled him, just as it had fooled the village, and the house of horror remained untouched, more secure than ever under the veil of sanctity. Margaret Ridley's doctrine did not live only in whispered prayers or cruel rituals. It lived in her writings. Hidden in drawers and beneath floorboards, her journals revealed a theology shaped not by compassion but by a hunger for control. The pages were filled with careful script, each line written with the discipline of a believer certain of her calling. She wrote that children were not born innocent but burdened with noise, with selfish cries, with the sin of wanting. In her view, the role of a mother was not to comfort but to strip away, to carve silence into them until nothing human remained. She called suffering a gift, insisting that pain burned away impurity like fire consuming straw. Her words were not wild or chaotic, but measured, organized, structured into sermons that read like scripture. She described silence as salvation, claiming that a child who never cried was closer to heaven than one who laughed. She taught that scars were marks of grace, proof that discipline had touched the body. Fire, she wrote, was the final purifier, turning flesh into ash and ash into angelic bloom. The roses in her garden were not mere flowers, but evidence of ascension, each petal a hymn, each root a prayer. To anyone else, her reasoning would read as madness, but within the neat order of her handwriting it carried the weight of conviction. The chilling power of her doctrine was not in its cruelty, but in its calmness. She did not rant, she did not rage, she reasoned. She believed herself chosen to continue a lineage of holy silence, convinced that every act of suffering she inflicted was service to a higher law. Thomas recorded method, but Margaret gave it meaning. She became the voice that justified the chamber, the table, the glass mouths, and even the furnace. Her words were not hidden shame, but a calculated theology meant to last beyond her life, a scripture of silence that she expected her children to carry into the next generation. In those writings, the Ridley cruelty revealed its true nature. It was not random violence, but a belief system, not a lapse of morality, but a structure built carefully over time. Margaret's doctrine was a faith of fire and silence, a religion of control dressed as devotion. And as long as her words endured, the horrors within Hollow Lane carried the weight of something far more enduring than madness. They carried the weight of a creed. The collapse of the Ridley house began not with outside judgment, but with those who had witnessed too much from within. The servants, bound for years by fear and silence, finally broke beneath the weight of what they had seen. The ash swept into the soil, the scars on children's faces, the smoke that never ceased. Whispers grew into resolve, and one night when the Ridleys slept, the servants carried torches into the hidden wing. They set fire to the chamber of ash first, then the rooms above, feeding the blaze with oil and cloth, determined that the horrors buried inside would never continue. The flames spread quickly, licking through the estate's dry timbers, swallowing curtains, devouring staircases, roaring louder than any voice had dared inside those walls. As the house burned, the structure revealed its secrets. Floors collapsed, exposing underground passages the villagers never knew existed. The fire lit up chambers carved into the earth, where wooden frames stood blackened, where shards of glass glittered among the embers, where bones cracked and splintered as the heat consumed them. The blaze did not erase evidence. It illuminated it, casting into the open what silence had long concealed. Half-burned journals were pulled from the wreckage, their pages scorched yet still legible, filled with Margaret's steady hand and Thomas's cold notes. They told of rituals, of discipline through fire and stillness, of children offered to silence. They were proof that what the villagers had suspected was true, but far darker than they had ever imagined. The Ridleys themselves were nowhere to be found. No bodies surfaced in the ashes, no bones were matched to their names. Some claimed they had perished in the fire, consumed like those they had once offered. Others whispered that they had escaped through hidden tunnels, vanishing into the night to begin anew elsewhere. The uncertainty only deepened the terror. The villagers were left staring at a ruin that smelled of smoke and death, knowing the family's silence had finally broken, but unsure if the evil itself had been destroyed. The house on Hollow Lane was gone, reduced to blackened stone and ash, yet its collapse did not bring peace. It left behind questions, bones, and words that would haunt long after the fire died. In the years that followed the fire, the ruins of the Ridley estate became a scar upon Hollow Lane, a place children were warned to avoid and elders spoke of only in whispers. Yet the horror unearthed there did not remain confined to ashes. The charred journals and uncovered bones forced the authorities to confront truths they could no longer ignore. Laws shifted quietly in the wake of discovery, demanding stricter records of births and burials, greater oversight of children behind closed doors, and accountability from families who once hid their practices under the cloak of wealth and piety. The changes were not announced as born from the Ridley tragedy. Their name was erased, struck from registers, denied the dignity of memory. But the reforms carried the shape of their crimes. A memorial was raised near the parish cemetery, a small stone slab without names, its inscription simple, "For the Silenced." It stood not as tribute to a family, but to those erased by them, a mark of grief for children who never had voices, never had graves, never had lives beyond the walls that consumed them. Villagers laid flowers there, many taken from the same soil that had once been fed by ash. The roses that bloomed so unnaturally during the Ridley's reign were uprooted, their roots burned, their petals scattered to the wind. In their place grew weeds and grass, plain and unremarkable, a landscape emptied of beauty but free of deceit. Yet the true legacy of the Ridleys could not be confined to stone or soil. It lingered in the minds of those who had admired them, in the shame of those who had ignored the signs, in the realization that evil can exist not as frenzy or chaos, but as order, calmness, and careful ritual. The Ridleys proved that cruelty could wear the face of charity, that suffering could be disguised as devotion, and that silence itself could be used as a weapon. Their story became less about what they had done and more about how long it went unseen. Even now, the memory unsettles. Evil does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, patient and methodical, hiding behind folded hands and gentle smiles. Sometimes it waits in the quiet, in the spaces where no one dares to look too closely. And so the question remains for every generation that follows. What do you think? Could this happen again, hidden behind calm faces waiting in silence?